Welcome, dear listener, to a space of calm and quiet, where the rush of the present fades into the gentle flow of the past. Settle into your comfort, let the weight of the day dissolve, and allow your mind to drift on a river of history, far from any worry or urgency. Tonight, we are going to talk about the history of the Holy Roman Empire for sleep, not as a dry list of facts, but as a long and lingering dream itself. We will trace the life of a unique idea, an empire that was neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire in the way we might think. Imagine it instead as a grand and ghostly tapestry, woven over 10 centuries with threads of faith, ambition, law, and tradition. Our journey will be slow, our tone will be soft, and our only goal is to escort you toward a state of peaceful rest. So release any need to remember dates or names. Simply let the narrative voice carry you from a spark in the darkness to a quiet, inevitable conclusion. Breathe deeply now, and let us begin this long, slow story together, as the first scene forms in the tranquil theatre of your mind. Chapter 1: The Seed of an Idea. In the soft, silent centuries that followed the fall of Rome, a great quiet settled over the heart of Europe. The grand roads, once thrumming with legionaries, were now pathways for pilgrims and local traders. The old order had dissolved into a mosaic of small kingdoms, each ruling its own valley, its own forest, its own stretch of river. Yet in that quiet, a memory persisted, a gentle whisper of unity and law that refused to fade completely. People looked back not with precise history, but with a hazy, golden recollection of peace under a single, distant emperor. This memory became a longing, a deep-seated yearning for a return to order amidst the fragmented world. It was a feeling, more than a plan, that hovered in the air like the mist over morning fields. The soil of the continent was waiting, patient and expectant, for a seed to be planted. That seed found its form in a man of the north, a Frankish king named Charles, who history would remember as Charlemagne. He was a tall, commanding figure, yet his greatness lay not in conquest alone, but in a profound desire to cultivate. He envisioned a realm knit together not merely by the sword, but by shared faith, by revived learning, and by a common law. His court became a haven for scholars, who carefully copied ancient texts by the flickering light of oil lamps, preserving wisdom for the future. He traveled tirelessly, administering justice, encouraging the building of monasteries which stood as beacons of stability in the countryside. For decades he worked, weaving a fragile tapestry of alliances and loyalties across vast stretches of land from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. He was building a garden in the wilderness, tending to it with a steady, patient hand, season after season. The heart of his vision was a spiritual one, a deep partnership with the Church in Rome. He saw the Christian faith as the single, strongest thread that could bind his diverse peoples together. He supported missionaries who ventured into pagan forests, not with force but with gentle persuasion, their chants blending with the sounds of the ancient woods. He built magnificent chapels, their stone arches reaching heavenward physical declarations of a new unifying devotion. In his mind, the authority of a king and the blessing of the Church were two sides of the same sacred coin, meant to guide and protect the souls and bodies of his people. This harmony was the very essence of the order he sought to create, a symphony where temporal and spiritual melodies were meant to play in concert. It was an idealistic vision, beautiful in its conception, yet delicate in its reliance on perfect balance. For years, this growing realm was simply a kingdom, albeit a vast and well-ordered one. It lacked the final, transcendent symbol, the link to that ancient, half-remembered glory of Rome. That symbol resided in the old city on the Tiber, with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The papacy in those turbulent times was itself in need of a protector, a strong hand to guard its spiritual authority from local Roman factions and other threats. An alliance of mutual need and shared ideal began to crystallize between the powerful Frankish king and the Vicar of Christ. They were two pillars, each strong but incomplete alone, recognizing that together they could support a much greater vault. The stage was being set, quietly and inevitably, for a moment that would transform a kingdom into the vessel for a millennium-long dream. The air in Europe seemed to grow still, as if holding its breath. That moment arrived as the year 800 drew to a close, with Charlemagne visiting Rome to settle disputes and affirm his role as the Pope's defender. The ancient city, with its crumbling monuments and vibrant Christian shrines, was a living map of the transition from the old world to the new. On Christmas Day, within the venerable walls of the original St. Peter's Basilica, the king knelt in prayer before the tomb of the apostle. The space was filled with the scent of incense and the soft, echoing chant of monks, the candlelight painting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. It was in this atmosphere of profound sanctity and history that Pope Leo III approached the kneeling king. In an act that would echo through the ages, he placed upon Charlemagne's head a golden circlet, a crown. The assembled crowd, guided, cried out to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans. The coronation was complete. Charlemagne, it is said, was surprised, though perhaps he understood the deep significance better than anyone. He was now an emperor, a title dormant in the West for over 3 centuries. This was not a revival of the old Roman Empire of senators and legions that was gone forever. This was the birth of something new, a Holy Roman Empire. Its holiness came from its consecration by the Pope, its Romanness from its claim to the universal authority of ancient Rome, and its imperial nature from its scope over many peoples. The seed, nurtured by Charlemagne's decades of labor, had finally broken the surface. A dream of unified Christendom, a realm of peace under God and Emperor, was now officially alive in the world. It was a fragile shoot, but it had taken root, and its long, slow growth through the centuries had begun. Chapter 2: A Crown in Candlelight. Let us linger for a moment in that sacred space on that Christmas night. Imagine the cool, still air of the basilica, a vast cavern of shadows pierced by countless points of flickering flame. Each candle represents a prayer, a hope, a life, gathered symbolically in this one room. The stones of the floor are worn smooth by centuries of faithful footsteps, connecting this moment to a deep, flowing river of time. The architecture itself is a bridge, built from the physical remains of the old empire to house the spirit of the new. High above, in the dark reaches of the ceiling, the smoke of incense curls and drifts, carrying pleas and praises heavenward. The very atmosphere is thick with intention, a palpable energy focused on the kneeling figure before the altar. This is not a political meeting hall, it is a threshold between the earthly and the divine. The man at the center of this universe of light and shadow is no longer just a king. He is Charles, ruler of the Franks and Lombards, patrician of the Romans. His shoulders are broad from a life in the saddle and in council, yet now they bear an invisible, immense weight. He feels the cool stone beneath his knees, the rough texture of his fine woolen cloak. His eyes are likely closed, his mind a whirl of thought and devotion, perhaps reflecting on the long journey that led him here, from his father's court, through bloody battles against Saxons and Avars, through the meticulous work of capitularies and missi dominici. He understands power intimately, but the ceremony unfolding around him speaks of a different kind of authority, one that is bestowed, not taken. It is an authority that comes from God, through the hands of his earthly representative. In the quiet of his prayer, he accepts this new mantle. Pope Leo III moves with the slow, deliberate grace of ritual. His robes, layered and rich, whisper softly with each step. His own path to this moment has been fraught with danger, having been attacked by Roman adversaries only a year before, saved only by fleeing to Charlemagne's protection. This act of coronation is, for him, an act of gratitude, of consolidation, and of profound political and theological statement. By placing the crown, he is asserting the Church's role as the source of imperial legitimacy. He is drawing the temporal power into the sacred orbit, making the emperor the strong arm of the Christian world. His hands, as they lift the circlet, are steady. The gold catches the candlelight, for a moment becoming a ring of pure, captured fire. It is a beautiful, heavy object, a closed loop with no beginning and no end, symbolizing eternity. The crown descends. Its weight is physical, a firm pressure on the brow, but its symbolic weight is immeasurable. In that instant of contact, centuries of history pivot. The Germanic tradition of kingship by acclamation of warriors merges with the Roman tradition of imperial majesty and the Christian concept of divine ordinance. A fusion occurs, creating a template that would define Central Europe for ages. As the metal touches his skin, Charlemagne becomes Augustus, a name from a distant past now revived for a different future. The assembled clergy, nobles, and Roman citizens erupt in the formal acclamation, their voices a unified wave of sound that rolls through the basilica, bouncing off the ancient walls. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans. The words are Latin, the language of law, scripture, and legacy. Outside the thick walls of the church, Rome sleeps under a winter sky. The everyday life of the city, the merchants, the farmers, the artisans, is unaware of the precise event transpiring within. Yet the consequences will slowly ripple outward like a stone dropped into a still pond, the circles expanding year by year, decade by decade. The coronation establishes a precedent of breathtaking ambition, that the Pope has the right to create an emperor. It forges an inseparable link between the imperial office and the defense of the Roman Church. This Christmas night becomes the foundational myth, the original scene to which future emperors and popes would look back, sometimes with pride, often with dispute. The candlelight of that service casts a very long shadow, one that will stretch across the map of Europe for 1,000 years. As the service concludes and the new emperor rises, the candles are gradually extinguished, one by one. The smoke lingers in the air, a fragrant ghost of the ceremony. The participants file out into the crisp night, their breath visible in the air, their minds full of what they have witnessed. For Charlemagne, the walk back to his quarters is a walk into a new reality. He must now consider how to rule as an emperor, how to translate this sacred moment into the practical governance of his vast domains. The dream has been formally inaugurated, clothed in ritual and sanctified by blessing. It is a living thing now, entrusted to his care. But like any living thing, it would need to be fed, protected, and would eventually grow in ways he could never have imagined that night, surrounded by candlelight and the echo of ancient titles. Chapter 3: The Dream Finds Its Name. The great Emperor Charlemagne passed from the world, and his carefully constructed empire, following Frankish tradition, was divided among his grandsons. The central portion, a long strip of land from the North Sea to Italy, would become the stage for the dream's enduring life. For a time, the imperial title faded, like a star obscured by clouds, but the idea it represented, the unity of Christendom under temporal protector, refused to die. It lingered in the prayers of monks, in the ambitions of kings, and in the continued need of the papacy for a powerful ally. The dream was dormant, not dead, its roots waiting for the right conditions to send up a new shoot. The map of Europe became a patchwork of smaller struggles, but the memory of that Christmas coronation remained a potent legend, a template for order. Nearly a century after Charlemagne, a new strong figure emerged from the Saxon lands of the north, Otto, later called the Great. He was a king of the Germans, a ruler of formidable energy and vision, who consolidated his power and looked southward. Once again, the Pope in Rome found himself in peril, threatened by local Italian princes and factions who sought to control the spiritual office for their own ends. The cry for help went north across the Alpine passes to the court of the German king. Otto, recognizing both a Christian duty and a supreme political opportunity, gathered his armies and crossed the mountains, descending into Italy like a decisive force of nature. He restored the Pope to his rightful authority, not out of mere charity, but as an investor in a sacred partnership. In gratitude and reenacting the sacred theatre of 800, Pope John XII crowned Otto as emperor in Rome in the year 962. This act was not a mere repetition, it was a confirmation and a permanent establishment. Otto's coronation cemented the special relationship between the German monarchy and the Roman papacy. More importantly, it tied the imperial title inextricably to the crown of the German kingdom. From this point forward, the road to the empire would almost always begin with being elected king of the Germans. The dream now had a permanent home, a specific nucleus. It was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The Holy affirmed its sacred mission, the Roman claimed its universal inheritance, and the German nation acknowledged its new, practical heartland. Otto and his immediate successors worked to make the dream a working reality. They appointed bishops and abbots as lords of vast territories, creating a class of prince-bishops, who were in theory loyal to the emperor because they owed their power to him, not through hereditary right. This was a clever stroke, aiming to balance the power of the restless, hereditary dukes who often pursued their own local interests. The empire's architecture became a complex blend of church and state, where a bishop could be both a spiritual shepherd and a temporal governor, collecting taxes and raising armies. The emperor saw himself as the overlord of this entire system, the guardian of the peace, the supreme judge, and the defender of the faith, his authority flowing from God through the Pope's coronation. This era saw the dream at perhaps its most confident and potent. Emperors like Otto III envisioned a renewal of the Roman Empire, with themselves as philosopher kings ruling from Rome in harmony with a revived papacy. They built palaces, commissioned magnificent artworks, and fostered a brilliant court culture that drew scholars from across the known world. The empire was seen as the terrestrial counterpart to the heavenly kingdom, a sacred order imposed upon the chaos of the world. Its laws were meant to reflect divine justice. Its peace, the Pax Dei or peace of God, was a church-led movement the emperors supported to limit violence. For a time, the ideal seemed within grasp, a unified Christian commonwealth, governed wisely, shining as a beacon for all of Europe. Yet even in this period of strength, the inherent tensions of the dream were visible. The very act of the Pope crowning the emperor contained a question: who was truly superior, the giver of the crown or its recipient? Furthermore, the emperor's power depended on constant travel throughout his realms, from the Rhineland to Rome, to assert his personal authority, for the administrative machinery of a true state did not yet exist. The empire was a network of personal loyalties, not an institutional bureaucracy, and the ambitious German dukes and Italian city-states always watched, waiting for a moment of imperial weakness to assert their own independence. The dream was magnificent, but it was built on a foundation that required constant, active maintenance. It was a garden that would quickly grow wild if the gardener's attention wavered for even a season. Chapter 4: The Tapestry of Princes. As the high medieval period unfolded, the nature of the empire evolved from a ruler's personal dominion into something more abstract and intricate. It became less about the person of the emperor and more about the system itself, a delicate, interconnected web of rights, titles, and territories. Imagine a colossal and endlessly complex tapestry, woven from threads of every color and thickness. One vibrant thread might be the Duchy of Bavaria, thick and strong, representing a powerful family with ancient roots. A shimmering gold thread could be the Archbishopric of Cologne, its wealth and spiritual authority intertwining. A fine, silvery thread might be a free imperial city like Nuremberg, owing allegiance to none but the emperor himself. Together, thousands of these threads formed the picture of the empire. The emperor's role was that of the master weaver, or perhaps the careful steward of the finished work. His power was not to command absolutely, but to mediate, to balance, to preserve the overall pattern from unraveling. He could not simply snap a thread he disliked. Each was knotted into the whole, with its own history and legal standing. His authority was based on feudal law and ancient custom. Princes, bishops, and cities held their lands as immediate vassals, meaning they held them directly from the emperor, not from any duke or count in between. In return, they owed him loyalty, counsel, and military support when called. This created a direct bond, but one that was often stretched thin over great distances and competing interests. The practical work of holding this tapestry together happened at grand assemblies called imperial diets. Picture a vast hall, filled with the murmur of voices in a dozen dialects. Here the electors, the 7 most powerful princes and bishops who had won the right to choose the emperor, sat in places of honor. Around them were the broader circles of lesser princes, counts, prelates, and representatives of the imperial cities. They debated laws, settled disputes, and voted on taxes for the common defense. The process was slow, deliberate, and often stalled by disagreement. It was governance by negotiation and consensus, a constant, gentle tension between the center's desire for unity and the periphery's desire for autonomy. The sound of the empire was often this sound, the low hum of diplomacy. This system had a beautiful, almost organic resilience. Because power was so diffuse, no single rebellion could easily shatter the whole. If a duke in the east grew rebellious, the emperor could rely on cities and bishops in the west for support. The empire could absorb shocks, adapt to change, and continue its existence even when it had no particularly strong emperor on the throne. It became a legal framework for coexistence, a peace treaty that lasted for centuries. For the ordinary people living under its umbrella, their primary world was their local lord, their town, their valley. The empire was a distant concept, a highest court of appeal, a source of prestigious titles, and a guarantee of certain traditional rights that protected them from the worst excesses of their immediate masters. Yet the very diffuseness that gave it strength also guaranteed its weakness. The empire struggled to act with speed or singleness of purpose. Raising an imperial army was a laborious process of requesting contingents from each prince, who might send them late, or poorly equipped, or not at all. While kingdoms like France and England were slowly centralizing power, building national identities and standing armies, the empire remained a collective. It had no permanent capital, no unified tax system, no single code of law that applied to all. The emperor was often the strongest prince among many, using the resources of his own hereditary lands, like the Habsburg family's Austria, to prop up his imperial authority, rather than commanding the resources of the empire as a whole. Thus, the empire settled into its mature form, not a sovereign state as we understand it, but a unique political organism. It was a corporate entity, a federation of hundreds of semi-independent states under a shared, ceremonial roof. The tapestry was beautiful to behold in its complexity, a masterpiece of medieval political thought, but it was static. It was designed for preservation, not for expansion or rapid innovation. It provided a stable, if often cumbersome, order for Central Europe, a space where trade could flow along protected routes, where the Pax Imperii, the imperial peace, was a real, if imperfect, ideal. The dream of unified rule had transformed into the reality of managed diversity, a quiet, persistent hum of coexistence that would define the heart of the continent for ages. Chapter 5: The Two Swords Diverge. The beautiful harmony between emperor and pope, the partnership that was the dream's very foundation, could not remain perfectly in tune forever. A quiet, profound disagreement began to murmur just beneath the surface of ceremonies and alliances. It was a question of ultimate authority. In the Christian world, did the spiritual sword wielded by the Pope command the temporal sword wielded by the Emperor, or were the two meant to be held in separate, equal hands? This was not a question for battlefields at first, but for theologians, canon lawyers, and diplomats, who debated it in cloistered libraries and solemn councils. Their dispute would gently but irrevocably pull at the threads of the imperial tapestry. This investiture controversy centered on a seemingly simple act: who had the right to appoint or invest a bishop with the symbols of his office, the ring and the staff. For the emperor, bishops were crucial administrators. They ruled vast lands, provided troops, and were pillars of imperial governance. Controlling their appointment was a matter of practical power. For the pope, this was a matter of sacred principle. Only the church could grant spiritual authority, and a bishop invested by a lay ruler might be more loyal to his earthly patron than to God and Rome. The clash came to a head in the 11th century between the formidable Pope Gregory VII and the equally determined Emperor Henry IV. Gregory declared that the Pope alone was supreme, and had the power to depose emperors. Henry, in response, declared the Pope a false monk and called for his removal. The drama that followed became the stuff of legend, illustrating the new power of the papal office. Henry, excommunicated and facing rebellion from his own princes who saw a chance to weaken him, was forced into an act of breathtaking penance. In the depths of winter in 1077, the emperor travelled to a castle at Canossa in northern Italy where the Pope was staying. For 3 days, Henry stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates, wearing the rough wool of a penitent, begging for forgiveness. It was a humiliating spectacle that demonstrated the Pope's moral authority could, in a crisis, trump imperial power. Gregory finally absolved him, but the psychological victory was complete. The image of the emperor kneeling in the snow was seared into the memory of Europe. A compromise was eventually reached, but the genie could not be put back in the bottle. The idea of papal supremacy had been forcefully asserted and had won a decisive symbolic victory. The unity of the two swords was broken. From this point on, the papacy and the empire were often rivals, not partners. Popes would frequently use the tool of excommunication to pressure emperors, and emperors would sometimes back rival popes in schisms. The dream's original blueprint, a seamless collaboration, was now cracked. The empire's universal claim was challenged by another universal claim emanating from Rome, one based on spiritual, not temporal, authority. This divergence had deep consequences for the internal structure of the empire itself. The princes of Germany watched these struggles between emperor and pope with keen interest. They often used the conflict to their own advantage, playing one side against the other to extract concessions and privileges that increased their own independence. When the emperor was weak or distracted by Italian campaigns or papal disputes, the princes solidified their own power within their domains. The central authority, caught between the rock of the papacy and the hard place of the princes, was slowly eroded. The emperor's attention was constantly divided, needing to manage Germany, assert rights in Italy, and navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics. Thus, the great struggle of the two swords left the empire permanently altered. It was no longer the unchallenged pinnacle of Christian society. It now had a powerful institutional competitor in the form of an assertive papacy. The dream of a perfectly ordered Christendom, with emperor and pope as twin pillars, had proven too ideal for the realities of human ambition and doctrinal dispute. The empire continued, but its foundations had shifted. It was now one power among others in a more complex European system, forced to negotiate, compromise, and share its once supreme stage. The quiet philosophical debate in cloisters had reshaped the political landscape, leaving the imperial tapestry still intact, but with its central image, the harmonious pair, forever changed. Chapter 6: The Heart Splits in Two. Centuries passed, and the empire settled into its complex, negotiated existence. Then, in the early 1500s, a change of a different, deeper nature began, not from palaces or battlefields, but from the soul of the people themselves. A German monk, an Augustinian friar named Martin Luther, wrestling with profound spiritual anxiety, came to a new understanding of faith, that salvation came by God's grace alone, through faith, not through the rituals and good works mediated by the Church. In 1517, he famously posted his 95 Theses, criticizing church practices, on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. It was an academic act, a call for debate, but it struck a chord that resonated like a great bell across the German lands and beyond. Luther's ideas, spread with miraculous speed by the new technology of the printing press, found fertile ground. They spoke to those weary of church corruption, to princes jealous of ecclesiastical wealth and power, and to ordinary people seeking a more direct, personal relationship with the divine. The Reformation was born not as a single event, but as a great and rising tide of religious fervor and reform. It immediately presented the Holy Roman Empire with its greatest crisis. The very holiness of the empire was predicated on the unity of the Catholic faith. Now, that unity was shattered from within. The Emperor, Charles V, a devout Catholic who ruled a global empire including Spain and the Netherlands, was duty-bound to defend the Church. Yet many of the German princes and free cities embraced Lutheranism, seeing in it both spiritual truth and a chance to seize church property and assert independence from both Pope and Emperor. What followed were decades of tension, negotiation, and sporadic conflict. The empire, true to its nature as a framework for managing diversity, sought a legal solution rather than immediate, all-out war. After much struggle, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established a monumental, if temporary, principle, cuius regio ius religio, whose realm, his religion. This meant each of the empire's numerous princes had the right to choose whether his territory would be Lutheran or Catholic, and his subjects would have to conform or leave. It was a pragmatic political settlement that acknowledged the irreversible split. The dream of a single, unified Christendom was formally, legally abandoned within the empire's own borders. The heart of the old dream was now a heart with two chambers, beating to different rhythms. This settlement brought an uneasy peace for over 60 years, but it froze the religious divisions into the political map. Bishops who converted to Protestantism could now secularize their lands, turning church territories into hereditary princedoms for their families. The delicate balance of power between Catholic and Protestant estates within the imperial diet became a constant, careful dance. The emperor, always a Habsburg and thus always Catholic, was now the leader of one party within his own empire, not the neutral overlord of all. The imperial crown represented the Catholic cause, making it harder to command the loyalty of his Protestant princes. The tapestry now had two dominant color schemes, often clashing, held together by a fragile legal thread. The peace finally shattered in 1618, triggering the 30 Years' War, a conflict of unspeakable brutality that was part religious war, part struggle for European hegemony, and part final constitutional crisis for the empire. German lands became the battleground for the armies of Sweden, France, Spain, and the Habsburgs. Villages were razed, populations decimated by war, famine, and plague. It was the empire's darkest hour, a nightmare of violence that seemed the utter negation of its original dream of peace. The war ended, exhausted, with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which expanded the religious settlement to include Calvinists and further strengthened the sovereignty of the individual princes at the expense of the emperor. When the dust settled, the Holy Roman Empire was forever changed. It was now explicitly a secular, legal framework designed to manage the coexistence of different confessions and sovereign states. Its purpose was no longer to embody a unified Christian world, but to prevent these different worlds within it from destroying each other. The holy, in its name, became more historical than descriptive. The dream had survived a near-mortal wound, but it had adapted into something older, quieter, and more mechanical. It was no longer a beacon of spiritual unity, but a well-crafted, if cumbersome, peace treaty written across the landscape of Central Europe, its primary function to maintain a calm and orderly silence after the terrible storms of belief. Chapter 7: The Pageant of Peace. Emerging from the ashes of the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire entered a long, autumnal period that stretched through the 17th and 18th centuries. The fires of religious zeal had burned themselves out, leaving behind a landscape of exhaustion and a deep, collective yearning for stability. The empire's role was redefined by this yearning. It transformed from an aspirational realm of Christendom into a sophisticated, intricate mechanism for preserving the peace. Its grandeur now lay not in power, but in ceremony, not in command, but in precedent, not in action, but in dignified existence. It became, in essence, a magnificent and slow-moving pageant. The focus of imperial life shifted to its formal institutions, which operated with the deliberate pace of a great clock. The imperial diet, now permanently located in the city of Regensburg, became a permanent congress of envoys. Princes no longer attended in person but sent representatives who lived there for years, even decades, in a genteel diplomatic community. They debated in solemn chambers, their discussions often circular and inconclusive, but that was almost the point. The process itself, the negotiation, the protocol, the meticulous recording of minutes, was the product. It provided a forum for airing grievances without resorting to arms, a theatre where disputes could be performed and contained rather than fought on battlefields. The emperor, always from the House of Habsburg, resided in his own splendid capital of Vienna. His power was now largely confined to his extensive hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Italy. As emperor, his role was increasingly symbolic and ceremonial. He was the fount of honors, granting titles like Imperial Count or Prince of the Empire that were coveted for their prestige. He confirmed the elections of bishops and abbots in the few remaining Catholic ecclesiastical states. He presided over a complex system of imperial courts that could, in theory, adjudicate disputes between the hundreds of member states. But his ability to enforce rulings depended entirely on the cooperation of the princes, which was often not forthcoming. He was the respected chairman of a board of powerful, independent directors. Society within the empire during this period developed a distinct, peaceful character, particularly in its hundreds of small states. In a prince-bishopric like Würzburg or a modest county like Sayn-Wittgenstein, life revolved around the local court. These micro-capitals saw a flourishing of regional culture, local orchestras were founded, small but elegant palaces and libraries were built, and a distinct, proud sense of place was cultivated. The constant threat of large-scale war had receded. While the great powers of Europe, France, England, Russia, fought global contests elsewhere, the empire's interior became a haven of relative quiet. The Pax Imperii was real, a soft blanket of legal tradition that dampened conflict and allowed the small flames of local culture to burn steadily. This era also saw the slow rise of a new ideal, the rule of law. The empire's complex web of treaties, precedents, and court decisions created a shared legal culture that transcended the borders of its individual states. A merchant in Frankfurt, a farmer in Saxony, or a knight in Swabia could, in theory, appeal to imperial law for protection against their own lord. This was often theoretical, but the existence of this higher legal framework was a stabilizing force. It encouraged princes to rule as enlightened administrators within their own domains, reforming laws and promoting education and economic growth, partly to demonstrate their legitimacy within the imperial system. The dream of order had evolved from a spiritual mandate into a legalistic one. Thus, the empire aged gracefully into a relic, but a functioning and valued one. It was an anachronism in an age of growing nation-states, yet it provided a service that none of those states could offer, a guaranteed structure for German-speaking Europe that prevented any single power from dominating the others completely. Its ceremonies, its diets, its courts were the gentle rituals of a shared home. The sound of this era is not the clash of swords, but the scratch of pens on parchment in chancelleries, the murmur of diplomats in conference rooms, the tranquil music of a court orchestra in a mirrored hall. The dream was no longer about unity or conquest. It was about maintenance, about preserving a delicate, complicated, and peaceful garden in a corner of a changing world. It was a pageant of peace, performing its slow, steady act day after day, year after year. Chapter 8: The Wind from the West. For all its peaceful inertia, the world outside the empire's ancient borders was changing at a pace it could not comprehend. A new wind was rising in the West, a wind of ideas that challenged every foundation of the old order. This was the Enlightenment, which preached reason, individual rights, and the authority of the nation, not of tradition or divine right. And more powerfully, this wind manifested in the political earthquake of the French Revolution, beginning in 1789. The revolution declared the end of kings, of feudal privilege, of the very kind of layered, traditional society that the Holy Roman Empire embodied in its most extreme form. Its ideas were a direct refutation of the empire's thousand-year premise. The revolution's armies, fueled by nationalist fervor and new citizen soldiers, did not just defend France, they exported its ideas by force. They swept into the German lands west of the Rhine, territories that had been part of the empire for centuries. There they dismantled the old order with breathtaking efficiency. Ecclesiastical states were dissolved overnight. Ancient knightly territories vanished. Free cities lost their independence. The French imposed rational, centralized administration, declaring that all men were equal before the law in a way the empire's complex hierarchy never could. For many common people, especially in the cities, these new ideas were intoxicating. The old tapestry was not just being torn, it was being thrown out and replaced with a clean, modern blueprint. Then came the force of nature who would harness this wind and turn it into a hurricane: Napoleon Bonaparte. A military genius of ruthless ambition, Napoleon saw the Holy Roman Empire not as a sacred institution, but as an irritating anachronism, a messy obstacle to his reorganization of Europe under French dominance. He defeated the Austrian armies, the empire's traditional defenders, in brilliant, humiliating campaigns. He did not just win battles, he redrew the map with casual authority. In 1803, he forced a massive, final reorganization called the Reichsdeputationsschluss, which secularized almost all the remaining ecclesiastical states and mediatized hundreds of small imperial knights and counts, folding them into larger neighboring territories. It was the greatest single reduction of the empire's complexity in its history, a brutal simplification executed by an outsider's will. Napoleon created a new political entity from these rearranged German lands, the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. Dozens of German princes, seeking survival and favor, left the empire and joined this French-sponsored coalition, accepting Napoleon as their protector. This was a death blow. The empire's essence was its universality over the German states. Now, a critical mass of those states had voluntarily walked away into a new, modern system. The empire was left a hollow shell, a rump state consisting essentially of the Habsburg lands and a few scattered loyalists. The ancient tapestry was in tatters, its threads cut and reknotted into a new, simpler pattern designed in Paris. The last emperor, Francis I of Habsburg, watched this erosion with a sense of grim inevitability. He understood that the imperial title, already weakened, was now a liability. Napoleon clearly coveted the prestige of the Roman emperor named for himself. To prevent the ancient crown from being seized by the Corsican usurper, Francis made the only move left to preserve its dignity. He would lay it down himself. The empire could not be stolen if it no longer existed. After consulting his advisors and facing the bleak new reality, he made his decision. The machinery of the thousand-year dream was about to be switched off, not by conquest, but by a voluntary abdication of its own idea. The wind from the west had blown so fiercely that the only way to save the tree was to fell it yourself. In Vienna in the summer of 1806, the final documents were prepared. The language was legal, dry, devoid of the poetic grandeur of the empire's founding. It stated the facts. The Electoral College and other imperial institutions had ceased to function, and many princes had left the Union. Therefore, Francis II declared the bonds of the empire dissolved, and considered himself released from his duties as its head. He would rule henceforth as Francis I, hereditary Emperor of Austria. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd in a cathedral. It was an administrative act, a signature on a page. With that quiet, bureaucratic stroke, the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had claimed continuous existence since the crowning of Charlemagne, was extinguished. The long dream was over, ended not with a defiant last stand, but with a sigh of resignation in a sunlit office, as a new and violent wind rattled the windows. Chapter 9: The Last Weaver Lays Down the Loom. Let us picture that moment in Vienna with a softer eye. Emperor Francis II is not a towering tragic hero, but a weary man burdened by the weight of an ending. His study is likely lined with books and maps, the very tools for understanding a world that is slipping from his grasp. The air is still, perhaps filled with the faint scent of beeswax and old paper. Outside, the city of Vienna goes about its business, but in this room, time has condensed. He holds a pen, an ordinary object that will perform an extraordinary act. Before him lies the proclamation, its text a formal admission of defeat, not by an army at the gates, but by the irreversible tide of history. His signature will not be a declaration of war, but a declaration of peace, with the inevitable. He thinks perhaps of his ancestors, of Charles V who ruled a world empire, of the medieval Hohenstaufens who clashed with popes, and further back to Otto the Great and the very myth of Charlemagne. He is the inheritor of all their struggles, their glories, and their compromises. And now he is to be the one who closes the book. There is a profound solitude in this act. The princes have already left, the institutions are paralyzed, the French eagles are perched on the Rhine. The tapestry he was meant to steward is already unraveled. His duty is simply to acknowledge that the weaving is done. He is not cutting the last thread in anger, but gently laying down the shuttle for the final time. The act itself is anticlimactic, which is fitting for an empire that had long since traded power for process. He signs his name. The ink is dark and wet for a moment before it dries. With that, the legal fiction that has sustained a political idea for a millennium is terminated. The Holy Roman Empire ceases to exist as a subject of international law. The thousands of treaties that referenced it, the oaths sworn to it, the complex web of rights and obligations that stretched from the North Sea to the Adriatic, all are now relics, historical footnotes. The room does not shake, no thunder sounds. The only consequence is a quiet shift in the ordering of the world, a change in the titles he will use from this day forward. In the days that follow, messengers carry the news to the remaining imperial courts of Europe. In Berlin, in Munich, in Dresden, the announcement is received with mixed feelings, some regret for the passing of an ancient tradition, but mostly a pragmatic calculation for the new order. For the hundreds of tiny sovereignties that had just been mediatized, it is the final seal on their extinction. For the common people, the news is abstract, less immediate than the price of bread or the movement of soldiers. Life continues. Yet something intangible has vanished from the atmosphere of Central Europe. A constant, a background hum of ancient continuity that had been present for 30 generations, has gone silent. Francis, now Emperor only of Austria, turns his attention to his hereditary lands, to shoring up his real power base against the Napoleonic storm. The decision, though painful, was a practical one. By shedding the hollow imperial title, he streamlined his own position and focused on preserving the Habsburg dynasty itself. The dream of universal empire is abandoned so that the reality of a strong Austrian state might survive. It is a trade of legacy for longevity, of a magnificent ghost for a solid body. In the archives, the Golden Bull, the election agreements, the records of the imperial diet all become historical documents, not living instruments of government. They are moved to libraries and museums, objects of study rather than tools of statecraft. And so the weaver lays down his loom. The great tapestry, begun in Candlelight 1,000 years before, is complete. Its final scene is not of triumph or tragedy, but of quiet resignation. It is a gentle ending, one that matches the empire's long, peaceful twilight. There is no catastrophic collapse, no sack of a capital, no last emperor dying in battle. There is only a man in a room, fulfilling the last duty of his office, to recognize when the story is over and to close the cover with care. The dream has run its course, and the dreamer finally awakens to a colder, sharper, and more modern dawn. The silence that follows is deep, and holds within it the memory of all that intricate, woven beauty now still. Chapter 10: Where Dreams Go to Rest. What remains after a dream of such duration? When the weaver lays down his tools and the great tapestry is rolled into the vaults of history, what lingers in the air? The answer is not found in borders or crowns, for those are gone. It is found in subtler things, in the quiet echoes and gentle imprints left on the land and the people. The Holy Roman Empire did not vanish without a trace. Instead, it dissolved like a morning mist, leaving the landscape subtly changed, damp with its memory. The dream has gone to rest, but its shadow still falls in certain lights. Look at the map of modern Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, and beyond. See the federal structure of Germany, with its powerful states like Bavaria and Saxony. These are the direct descendants of the powerful duchies and kingdoms of the empire. The very idea of decentralized power, of a central government negotiating with strong regional entities, is an ancient imperial pattern woven into the modern constitutional fabric. The concept of the Rechtsstaat, a state based on codified law, has deep roots in the empire's centuries of legal precedent and its attempt to rule through courts and diets, not just by royal whim. Travel through the old heartlands. In every ancient town square, you might find a weathered stone eagle, the imperial symbol, carved above a doorway or on a fountain. Countless cities still bear the proud title, Freie Reichsstadt, in their historical documents, a ghost of their former immediacy to the emperor. The breathtaking ecclesiastical principalities are gone, but their monuments remain. The sublime Cologne Cathedral, a project supported by emperors for centuries. The residence in Wurzburg, a palace of a prince-bishop that rivals any king. These stones were laid under the auspices of the empire. They are its physical skeleton, its beautiful, silent bones. The cultural and intellectual landscape, too, bears its mark. The empire was the world of Bach and Handel, of Dürer and Holbein, of Goethe and Schiller. This incredible flowering did not happen despite the political fragmentation, but in many ways because of it. Dozens of small courts meant dozens of patrons, creating a competitive, vibrant cultural ecosystem. The lack of a single, overpowering cultural capital like Paris allowed for regional diversity and innovation to flourish. The dream of unity may have faded, but in its long twilight, it provided a stable, if complex, framework within which the German language and a common set of cultural references could develop across a vast region. Most profoundly, the empire bequeathed a certain mindset, a tendency toward compromise and consensus, a deep-seated aversion to any single power dominating the whole. The experience of the 30 Years' War taught a terrible lesson about the cost of religious and political absolutism. The subsequent centuries of the empire were a lesson in managed difference. This legacy of seeking balance, of building complex legal and political structures to accommodate diversity, became a hallmark of Central European political thought. It is a quiet, pragmatic wisdom born from 1,000 years of trying to hold 1,000 pieces together. And so, the Holy Roman Empire finds its rest not in a tomb, but in the living world it helped shape. Its dream of unified Christendom is over, but its legacy of complexity, law, and cultural richness endures. It is a reminder that political forms can be vast, slow-moving, and ultimately ephemeral, yet they can shape civilizations in lasting ways. The night has now grown deep. The story of the empire, from its first spark in a dark age to its quiet dissolution in a modern one, is complete. Its echoes have faded into a soft, harmonious silence. Let that same silence now wash over you, calm and deep. The dream of empire is done. It is time at last for your own rest. Close your eyes, let go, and sleep. And so, dear listener, the final threads of this ancient tapestry have been woven, and the long, quiet dream of empire has faded fully into the silence of history. We have followed its gentle arc from a candlelit coronation to a quiet signature in a sunlit room, a journey of 1,000 years now complete. Thank you for allowing this story to be the companion for your rest, for letting its echoes of forgotten centuries lull your mind into a state of deep calm. May the sense of time's vast and patient passage ease any lingering tensions, replacing them with the profound peace that comes from stories well concluded. As you settle now into your own quiet, remember that the past is at rest, and so too can you be. I wish you the most serene and replenishing sleep, filled with gentle dreams. If this peaceful journey has helped you find rest, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel for more stories to guide you into tranquil slumber. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep deeply, and know that a world of calm awaits you each night here.